Okay, hello everybody. So yes, I'm Christy Dena, and I'll be talking to you about the secrets to creating an indie game franchise. But why are these secrets, first of all? You know, why aren't the techniques to develop a franchise actually common knowledge? And I mean that. Why aren't we all learning how to do this as part of our craft? And you may be thinking, well, Christy, franchises are about revenue streams. But that's the business etymology, the historical origins of the term, which kicked in about the 16th century onwards. But for us here at the Narrative Summit, as writers, as designers, as narrative designers, as directors, we have the problem of crafting multiple art forms into a whole experience. Games, films, books, soundtracks, whatever. Why isn't this common knowledge? Well, it's because there's a lot of resistance to making in multiple art forms. I know I've been battling these resistances for over 20 years. You've heard of the 10,000 hour rule? Well, that's the idea that the idea that stuck with people is this: if you hope to be any good at anything, then you have to be doing one thing over and over again for a very long time. And what's associated with that is the idea that you will be a jack of all trades and a master of none if you actually work in more than one. So we all believe that working in multiple art forms either dilutes or corrupts your creative development rather than enhancing it. That is a factor that stops us. It's also the not us resistance. It's the belief that each art form is so substantially different that it's not what we actually do. Writers don't talk about media. Game devs don't talk about linear media. If it's not interactive, it's not us. It's also the not now. It's the fear that maybe your interest in more than one art form is perhaps some elaborate procrastination exercise. That you shouldn't do it now, you should actually focus on one art form. And it's also the not you resistance. It's the idea that you couldn't possibly be a polycreative, a polymath of creativity, someone who could create great things in more than one art form. It's also the idea that a franchise is not art. But I've created, consulted, and mentored and judged hundreds and hundreds of transmedia projects around the world. And I'm here to tell you that a franchise is something you can learn to craft, and I'll show you how. So this is where you probably start. You look at AAA franchises and think that you need to create webisodes on YouTube, bring out novelizations and graphic novels, a feature film, some merchandise, and a soundtrack, and maybe do an alternate reality game. But you can't do those on an indie budget. You can do scaled down versions like a PDF and a webisode perhaps, but even then, how do you decide which one to actually pursue? Just knowing what art forms are available to you is not enough. The common wisdom is choose the art forms that have the most market penetration, in other words, that most people are actually using. But the thing what's great about indies is you can decide what's best for the project rather than those constraints. So step one. Step one is to actually start with the premise that your franchise is shit. Here's a book by Steven Pressfield, who wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance when he was 51. The book is called Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit. And he learnt this when he was working in advertising, where no one wants to read your stuff. And he explains that once you start with the idea that nobody automatically wants to read your shit, that you develop empathy. You ask yourself, why don't they want to read it? Why don't they want to play my game? And with this quote here, you acquire the skill that is indispensable to all artists and entrepreneurs, that the ability to switch back and forth between your imagination from your own point of view as a writer-developer to the point of view of your player. You're thinking about what the player is thinking and experiencing at each point. And this approach is behind successful projects in all art forms. So let's have a look at how you can action this and how this relates to franchises. Here we have, in Hollywood, there is a technique called the sequence approach, which some of you will be familiar with here. It was developed by Frank Daniel, who, after analysing hundreds of successful screenplays, realised it was an emerging best practice that would help us all make great screenplays. Frank was a screenwriter himself, a playwright, a novelist, had a master's degree in music, and a doctorate in film. And he influenced generations of filmmakers in his role as the director of the Australian Film Institute, the American Film Institute, as well as he was head of film at USC, as well as Columbia, and he was artistic director of Robert Redford's Sundance Institute, the first artistic director. And interestingly for us, his sequence approach focuses on how the audience will experience the story and what the writer can do to make that experience better. So just quickly, what is the sequence approach? So basically, what it does is it takes the existing structure that we all use, and you can see here with the beginning, middle, and end, and adds shorter sequences. But the emphasis here is not on the shorter sequences, but that these sequences are driven by an audience question. The crucial point to this approach is to think about what drives the audience interest at each point in your film. What questions drive them? What are they thinking about? And so you are the one then that designs that interest with a ticking clock, with dramatic irony, which is when we know more than the characters know, and importantly with dramatic tension, when we are withholding an anticipated resolution. Now, this thinking about the audience experience, what is in their mind and what they know right now and what they're expecting next, is common to all successful works. So, for example, Brian Upton, who was the co-founder of Red Storm Entertainment, where he designed the original Rainbow Six and Ghost Recon, and was senior game designer at Sony, he talks about situational design, where the nexus of play is not in the transactions, it's not in the actions, it's not in the interface. The nexus of play is in the player's mind. And he talks about the importance of designing for player anticipation. Okay, so how does this actually work in a game? Well, let's have a look at What Remains of Edith Finch. So our first question is one that seems that it will drive us right to the end of the game, and that is, what remains of Edith Finch? Like, what does that actually mean? And then, when we actually are going through the beginning of the play, we find another one that comes in very early, and that is, how do I get to the house? The designers have strategically placed a house in the distance, a weenie, as we know, to get us to think about where we are to go and what we are to do. And then they mention that we have a key. So the developers have us thinking, what does this key open? I need to find something that needs this key. You see how these questions also work as objectives. We have a writing approach, a design approach, all operating together. And then, if we've had these previous small questions answered to our satisfaction, then it is more likely that the players will actually continue through to the rest of the game. In fact, Brandon Sanderson, a best-selling science fiction and fantasy writer, talks about this technique as a promise. He doesn't see it as a question, but as an open bracket and a closed bracket. You promise that something will happen, and then you follow it through. You indicate to the reader that your story will be about something, and then you deliver on it. Now, you all know this in terms of genre. You know that you promise a player, if you promise a player that it's a party game, it's a first-person shooter, it's an open-world game, it's a horror, it's a comedy, whatever it is, you actually have to deliver on the expectations of those genres. It's a feedback loop where our players engage in a continuous reappraisal, and these promises are one factor in how they decide and why we must deliver. I really like the notion of a promise because it's about what the players are thinking about. It's also what we're signalling what we will provide, and also with the word promise, it implies that we have a responsibility to honour it. Okay, so how can we use this for our shit franchise? If we agree we all have this best practice of switching between our point of view and our players, of designing for leading promises and keeping them, then we have an approach that we can use across art forms in our franchise. You see, we can think about the questions in our players' minds before they get to the game. Why do our players want to play our game? Then Why do they want to watch our webisode? Why do they want to read our graphic novel? Why do they want to listen to our soundtrack? And we're not alone. A study by Kultima and Stenros looked at game experience models, and they thought, well, if we really think about this from the perspective of the player, there need not be any separation of the different parts of the experience. The experience of the player starts before they've opened the game and continues after in the other art forms. And here, James Ernest, founder of Cheap Ass Games, former writer at Wizards of the Coast and former game design manager at Microsoft, he says, if I had to pick one thing that games should have, it is a reason to play. He continues saying, I don't like to say hook because that implies superficiality. It's not just a foot in the door, it's the reason you keep coming back. It's what distinguishes a hit from a flop between two games that are empirically identical. So what are these promises? What are these promises for a franchise? What are the promises that invite your players to play the game and then watch the film, listen to the music, to read the book? Now, you already know a few. Here's some. You experience them all the time. We've got personality, nostalgia, spectacle, and novelty, to name a few. I'll just do a quick shout out here to Marigold Bartlett, who's the artist for all of these illustrations that we have here. Okay, so personalities. You all know the promise of the personality, or stars, right? It's Angelina Jolie playing Lara Croft, or Stephen Merchant voicing Wheatley, or it's the actual characters themselves, or auteur directors. It's the reason why Eli Roth was brought in to do the animated trailer for Dark Souls 3. It's musician and filmmaker Rob Zombie being brought in to do an animated short for Assassin's Creed Unity. It's the appeal of Rami for Vlambeer Games. So what is the personality promise? The personality promise can be credibility, assurance of credibility, but it can also be the promise of being with someone who lives a life we want to live, that we want to be. Nostalgia is something that you may be familiar with. It's the 8-bit games, it's pixel games, such as Sword and Sorcery and Nidhogg, the 1930s animated game Cuphead. What the nostalgia promise does is it delivers on positive memories. It's the comfort that you feel with those memories. And the thing about nostalgia is if you don't have positive memories with them, it won't be a promise you're after. If 8-bit games are not something that you remember fondly, it won't appeal to you. Spectacle is a promise that we know too. Think of a Transformers trailer and you get what a spectacle is about. It can be many things, however, that widen our eyes in some way. It can be the visual beauty of the blue and green marine life of Abzu, or the black splatter on white in the unfinished Swan, or the photorealism of Assassin's Creed. What is the promise of the spectacle? It's the promise that you will experience awe, A-W-E, awe. So related to spectacle is novelty, and how things that aren't the status quo actually draw our attention. It's Pokemon Go, which for many introduced them to augmented reality gaming. It's Johann Sebastian Joust, where you're not using screens but move controllers and dancing around each other. It's Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, where instead of playing a game by yourself in a VR headset, you're yelling out commands to a mate. But in those sorts of games, there's also a social promise operating too. So indeed, it may be that the more of these promises that you actually offer and deliver on, the higher likelihood of not just player acquisition, which is gaining new players, but also player retention, keeping your players. So what are the other promises that your players want and you can provide in a multi-platform context? Why is it that they stay with your IP? So here are the key cross-art form promises. The promises that help your players cross art forms. They are, if you like, the genres of crossing art forms. They are why your players go from your game to your soundtrack to your graphic novel. They are the promises you signal and then need to keep. So let's zip through a few. The first one, the revealing promise. It's about revealing more. It's more information, more characters, new mechanics, new stories. It's a sequel, it's a prequel. It's anything that primarily offers a new insight. It's when you get to the end of Kentucky Route Zero, a Kentucky Route Zero episode, and you want the story to continue. You want to find out what happens next. Let's have a quick look through some examples. The Revealing Promise is in the card game Consentical, where you're engaging in a mutually satisfying and consensual intimate encounter with an alien. And you can go straight into playing the game, but the Kickstarter backers also have the option of a 12-page prequel, where they can find out how the characters actually meet and what stands in their way. So it's something that can be enjoyed before playing the game or after, either setting up character motivations or giving context. And then there is the game That Dragon Cancer, that tells the true personal story of Ryan Green and his family as they raise their son Joel, who is diagnosed with terminal cancer. We follow the family through the hospital treatments, the playgrounds, the church, and then Joel's afterlife when he dies at age 5. In what is perhaps the most heart-wrenching prequel there is, the book released almost a year to the day before his passing is titled He's Not Dead Yet. And the point of this is that these are techniques that you can action in any way. And how about the hidden object game Hidden Folks, where you can also keep playing more games on the playable t-shirt and the playable poster? The point being that the Revealing Promise is not always about narrative. The Revealing Promise is also meeting the interest of revealing more about the actual creation of the game, the games in the case of 120 Years of Lambia. Their collection includes art, but also their game and audio design and studio beginnings. So you may notice I've also got the Reliving Promise there as well, because in some ways players are reliving moments from the games. But if we look at fan interest in art books, we see a definite leaning towards the Revealing Promise more than the Reliving one. Many say that they prefer to see more works in progress than the final art. And so this is an example of how knowing how these promises operate can help with your decisions. So onto the Reliving Promise. So the Reliving Promise, it's about providing a dependable pleasure. What that dependable pleasure is determined by you and the players. It's the eternal question of what stays the same and what changes, right? Often audio moments continue across projects. It's the submarine clang that Grant Kirkhope took from the GoldenEye film and put into the game. Or the music and opening flying sequence over the pine trees and mountains in the Twin Peaks. So changes can happen around those dependable pleasures. An example is Papers, Please, which gives us key moments that we know from the game. I haven't got that here for some reason, it's disappeared. Okay, I'm going to skip that. But you know Papers, Please, and basically it's the short film of the game with a lot of the mechanics that we see in the game also happening in the film. Here's another example, Brain and Brain's Burly Men at Sea. Some of you would have played this. They promise a great reliving experience. After playing through their folktale adventure, which you can play through again and again, exploring different regions, at the end of each playthrough, you had given a code, which is depicted in a digital book, which is on the bookcase there. And then you can go to their website, put in the code, and order a printed book version of your personal playthrough through the game. But the art, while the same as being in the game, was so different in key places that I didn't feel as if I was experiencing the key moments I wanted again. So this is an example of what Donald Norman calls the gulf of execution, where the actions that we provide do not correspond with the intentions of our users, not meeting the promise. But if we, as creators, know what our players are expecting, so then we can nuance the emphasis between the familiar and the unfamiliar accordingly. I don't know what's happening to my slides. Okay. Another example here is Kentucky Route Zero, which has lots of interludes between all of their acts. Games and stories. The most recent features a live-action video footage of the local community television station and a digital game version of it. Having the same event juxtaposed in two art forms forces you to look at the differences between them in a exciting way. And the creators are very aware of the player experience of these projects and will rewards them with lots of intertextual references between the two works. So for instance, in the live action video, the character there, Rita, she mentions, oh, we're about to have a guest on who you may have already met, referring to the fact that if you'd played the game before watching the video, you would have met her there. And their references actually go quite further, and Robert Yang has written a post about the fact that they also do references to player discussions there as well. And the one thing that Cardboard Computer devs also use a lot of is the inhabiting promise. There are two key ways that the inhabiting promise can be met, which is basically about the promise to be inside a created world. Inhabiting can occur via transportation to the creative world, or it can happen when the created world transports to us. So let me explain that a bit further. It's being able to explore the alien world of Pandora at the theme park, or being able to enter Van Gogh's In the Bedroom painting. As you can see in the picture there, you could actually hire out this room when the Art Institute of Chicago teamed up with Airbnb. So you can transport away from your world and immerse yourself into the created world. An example is You Must Be 18 or Older to Enter, where the conceit is you're alone at home and you heard about this thing called porn at school. Opportune cough. So this installation that was actually set up at Slam Dance, the nifty thing about this experience is that on the other side, you can see a window there. On the other side of the window, that's where people were getting their photograph taken. And so there were moments in the game where it suddenly takes over with all the moaning sounds of porn. So you quite literally feel the embarrassment of having other people witnessing you feeling porn, which is exactly what the game is designed to do. And so the key essence of the end point of the game experience is then articulated in the installation. So the reverse of transportation is when the created world enters your world, enters the player's world. An example is Questions, The Magic Circle, which is a metafictional game where you play the protagonist in an unfinished game. You can wander through the unfinished world and hear the trials of the designers stuck in development hell. And now the company Question also have the usual website and their press kit, but they've also created a website for the fictional developers with their own social media and their own press releases. So the world actually overlaps with our own. Another one is Jacob's game Paradigm, which is a surreal adventure game set in a strange post-apocalyptic Eastern European country. Jacob has the protagonist actually existing on Tinder. There is a travel guide for the fictional country you can get and a book on the fictional religion. There's also a floppy disk that you can buy for the game, which doesn't work, but there's a bit of a nostalgia promise there. Now, I have bought the floppy disk, but not the game yet. And so this is an example of different art forms appealing to different people, but also potentially being a conversion tool. There are so many examples of the inhabiting promise. The Alan Wake Files book that is credited to the in-game author, the play in Kentucky Route Zero that you can buy and is credited to the in-game character, the Pip-Boy that you could actually purchase and use. In fact, this inhabiting promise is such an allure that in the upcoming Star Wars theme park, there are areas that you will only be able to get in-fiction merchandise. Okay. So the shaping promise, the final one here, is something different. We all know fan fiction and the creations that fans make in response to your creative projects, if you're lucky. You have no control over that. Players do that if they want. But when you, as developers, facilitate that happening in your creative projects, you're working with the shaping promise. It's the promise of being able to allowing the players to make it more like them. An example is mods. And recently we had one with the Game Master's Toolkit that Defiant Development have offered for players to make their own encounters and full challenges. And it's something that they said they knew that their community would want. It's also figurines, which can be a way for us to play out our own adventures with the characters we love and want more of, like Boba Fett and Maisie. Indeed, you could conceivably say that the more of these promises that you offer and deliver on, the more likely you are to appeal to a range of players and keep them. And I have mentioned some key ones today. So when you're deciding what media you'll choose, it isn't about what the big studios do or even what art form is popular necessarily. Everyone may be doing graphic novels, but it may not be of any interest to you personally or fit your game world. The key that we've learned today is not to decide purely based on the object, the media. The critical aspect that will make or break the design of your indie game franchise is to think about what your players are looking for. They're looking beyond your media to something else, to the revealing, reliving, inhabiting, and shaping promises. But lastly, there's something even more powerful than all of these. It is the ultimate multiplier. It's something that, once again, operates in all art forms because it operates in all people. And it's the values promise. The promise of giving the player something they believe in being. Shalom Schwartz, in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Marketing, explains how our values have been shown to influence our career choices, our political persuasions, our feelings of well-being, and for us now, what entertainment we choose to engage with. And he researched the recurring values that have happened across 20 countries and has published the results, which I use in my design. I use this on top of theme. Indeed, Nina Simone, the executive director at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, talks about the importance of relevance in drawing visitors into museums. She warns that it doesn't matter how powerful the experience is inside the room, how great your game is, film, TV, or whatever, if most people don't even choose to enter it. So you have to think about why they come to you and what value they actually get. And the more you start to matter to people, she explains, the more they will desire opportunities to actually go deeper. They will come back and they will ask for more. And I will add this, that if you actually don't think about values in your design, they will still be there, but they will default to the values of the status quo. But if you consciously think about them, they may be different and will resonate with players. Take David Riley's Everything. You have the game, you have the 10-minute gameplay film, and you have the soundtrack, and you also have the Alan Watts recordings that were specially made for the game that you can also purchase. And throughout all of them are the values of self-direction, for instance, and universalism. You can be introduced to the values through the film. You can purchase the soundtrack to relive the game, but you can also purchase the voiceover recordings of Alan Watts to take those words, to listen to them, and let them change you. So creating your own indie game franchise is possible. You experience lots of art forms every day as players. It's time to practice it as designers. Resist all the forces that are holding you back. The secrets have actually been right in front of us. Indeed, if we look even further back in history, beyond when the term franchise was all about commercialization and rights, we find that it actually derives from the French verb franchir, with apologies, franchir, which means to go beyond the limits of something, to jump over, to cross a threshold, to give liberty to make free. So go forth and free the art forms that you have inside you and make that indie franchise. Thank you for your time.